It's Halloween night. You've maybe had a couple of drinks, and you go to a graveyard with your friends. A graveyard that's rumored to be haunted. Haunted by the lonely, sorrow-filled spirit of a woman in a white wedding dress, who on the day of her wedding was killed by her fiancé. So she wanders the graveyard at night, hoping to take revenge on anyone who reminds her of her fiancé. And so, because you're a little bit drunk and you're with your friends, you decide, let's use a Ouija board and try and connect with the spirit of the dead. And as you have the Ouija board there in front of you, the planchette starts to move. But when the alcohol begins to wear off, you ask yourself, is this real? Or is there some science behind a Ouija board? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we get started, I'd like to invite all of you guys to go grab yourself a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to bring out those autumn flavors, and we will jump right in. So, look, for those of you who know me, you know that Halloween is my favorite time of year. And, it's September now, and, I just had to do this episode. We're getting too close to spooky season for me not to do this episode. Also, I was watching a ghost hunting show on YouTube, and so these air quotes ghost hunters were in this really allegedly haunted hotel, and they had two mediums with them, and so nothing paranormal really happens. Maybe they hear a knock on a door here or there, but other than that, nothing paranormal happens. So at the end of the video, they, of course, pull out a Ouija board and do a seance. And they, of course, connect with a spirit who roams the halls of this haunted hotel. And so I was watching this, and I already had a good idea of the science behind Ouija boards. And so I was curious. So I went to Google Scholar, right? Where usually you find a bunch of actual scientific research papers, and I Googled how do Ouija boards work. And ladies and gentlemen, I kid you not, every single air quotes paper was either from the Christian Ministry of Evangelical Teaching, or it was from some sort of spiritualism society. And it really, really irritated me. And it irritated me because the actual science behind it was very inaccessible for the general public to access. So that's the other reason why I decided to do this episode. Hold on, I need to grab a sip of my coffee there. So I also want to say before we start this episode, ladies and gentlemen, I personally do believe in spirits, and I know that's a little odd coming from a man of science, but I do believe in spirits. But Ouija boards, no. And I do not believe in Ouija boards one bit. And hopefully at the end of today's episode, you will have a good understanding of why I think Ouija boards are a bunch of hocus pocus. So before we can talk about the science behind Ouija boards, I think it's important to first establish the history of where they came from. So I was reading this one paper or article about Ouija boards, and they're like, the history is mysteriously hard to track down. It's not hard to track down, so I tracked it down for you. Here it is. But of course, that article had a bias, and that was sad because that was a Smithsonian article, and the overall premise was that Ouija boards are real, which was disappointing. But anyway, here's the history for you. So the first Ouija boards appeared in an advertisement in Philadelphia in February 1891. And were they originally for spirit detection? No, actually. I was surprised about that, but they were marketed as a toy that it's Ouija, the wonderful talking board. It can answer questions about the past, present, and future. It'll entertain you for hours with its surprisingly accurate answers. And so it was originally marketed as a toy for kids to like predict the future with. And then around the end of the 19th century, two sisters from upstate New York named the Fox sisters not only brought Ouija boards into the mainstream culture, but they brought the idea of seances into mainstream as well. So the Fox sisters were two sisters that lived in upstate New York, and they made a name for themselves by saying they could communicate with the dead. And so what they would do is they would invite generally rich people to come in and talk with their dead loved ones. And while one sister did the seance, the other sister would make the chairs move or the lights turn off or knock on the table. And it was all a conjuring trick. But nobody knew that at the time. Well, I'm sure some people did. But most people didn't know that at the time. And so everything about them was marketed as they're witches or they had a deep connection with the spirit world. And this continued on for years. And eventually, because of the Fox sisters, they created basically an economy, a movement for spiritualism and seances and being able to connect with the dead. However, at the end of their lives, they admitted that everything they did was BS, that it was all a magic trick. It was all a conjuring trick. They admitted that their makeshift Ouija boards, which were basically glass bottles on a table where you had pieces of paper in a circle and numbers, and the bottle would move when you touched it. They admitted that was a trick. They admitted that, the moving chairs up and down was a trick, etc. They admitted everything they did was a trick, but the movement that they had created became so big that nobody really listened to them anymore. And people went on believing that everything that they said, even though it was nonsense. And so why do I bring these two up? I bring these two up because these two kind of popularized the Ouija board for use in the seance. So before the Ouija board, seances were a big thing in Europe, and they kind of came over to America around 1848. But they were a big thing in Europe, and in Europe you would use a wine glass on a table within a circle made out of the 26 letters of the alphabet and 9 numbers, 1 through 9. And you would touch the wine glass and it would move, just like a Ouija board. And so when the Ouija board came out in 1891 as a kid's toy to, air quotes, predict the future, the Fox sisters used it in their seances. And this idea that it could connect and communicate with the dead became popularized. And it still lingers around it to this day. And in fact, even the article from the Smithsonian, even the article from the Smithsonian said that the Ouija board has mysterious power that nobody fully understands, which, ladies and gentlemen, leads us beautifully into the real purpose of this episode, the science behind Ouija boards. So what is the science behind Ouija boards? Well, long story short, the planchet or the device that you put on a Ouija board moves because of unconscious motor movements by people. And now I know there are some of you out there right now who are probably like, well, Atticus, I've used Ouija boards and I wasn't moving it. And it's like, well, you didn't think you were moving it, but in reality, you probably were. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, the movement here is actually kind of complex. So let's begin with 2 examples. Imagine you're cooking dinner, right? And you have a skillet on the grill or on the stove, and you move the handle of the skillet into the stove so that it doesn't get knocked over and you go off to go and grab more ingredients from the garage. Your girlfriend comes over and doesn't realize the handle of your skillet is over another burner, and she turns on her burner. And then when she realizes it's a little too late because the handle got too hot, so she turns off her burner and she goes to look for you. And you come back and you grab the handle of that skillet. What happens? Well, if it's burning hot, you jerk your arm back. Now, when you jerk your arm back, ladies and gentlemen, are you consciously thinking, hey, this is really hot, let me move my hand back? No, you're not. Now, why do you move back? The reason is because of a reflex arc. So a reflex arc is where you have a pain receptor, a nerve, that takes a pain signal, shunts that pain signal up to the brain, but it doesn't go to conscious perception. Instead, it's processed by subconscious perception. Why? Because subconscious perception is far faster than conscious perception. And so then the motor cortex of the brain subconsciously sends your arm a signal. It sends your flexors a signal to release that pan, the handle of the skillet, and it sends your rotator cuff muscles to move your arm backwards away from that hot heat source. And this is really fast, and you do this unconsciously. You're not consciously thinking about moving. Another example is called the hypnic jerk. And so I know that's a weird phrase. I've never used that before. But what this is it's basically jerking awake suddenly while you're sleeping. I'm sure all of you have had an experience where you're sleeping, you have a comfortable dream, and then all of a sudden you just jerk awake. And that's called the hypnic jerk. Now, why is that? What basically happened there is your unconscious brain or your subconscious brain sent a signal to your motor cortex subconsciously to jerk you awake. Now, it could be due to a variety of things, but that's basically what it is. And so, how does this apply to Ouija boards? Well, it applies to something called the ideomotor effect or ideomotor actions. And unfortunately, this has kind of become a meme because of a really stupid horror movie called Ouija that was released a couple years ago, where in the first 5 minutes, one of the characters is using a Ouija board and it moves and she's like, ah! And so she Googles how does a Ouija board work, and she watches a video, and in the video they say ideomotor effect, and then she dies from a demon or something. And so it kind of gave this a bad name, but in reality it's true. So what is the ideomotor effect? In essence, the ideomotor effect is a movement or a series of movements that are controlled by your subconscious, resulting in a complete lack of awareness that they are occurring by you. And so how this applies then to Ouija boards is basically this. So if you are at a Ouija board, even with other people, usually when people perform or use a Ouija board, it's usually in a place where they know that there's some paranormal activity occurring. You know, like for example, your house has paranormal activity occurring. So you look through the public records and find it's haunted, and you see the name of a spirit, Jack, mentioned. Or, you go to a haunted house on Halloween, and you know the entire history of this place, and you want to see if you can connect with one of the spirits there. And you may not know the names of the spirits in your head, but your subconscious does. And so what happens then is when you're lightly holding the planchette, basically when you're asking questions, your subconscious responds. And when your subconscious responds, that sends a motor signal, much like a reflex arc, to the muscles in your arm to move that planchette. And even if you're the one doing it, because it's a subconscious signal that's being sent by your brain to your motor cortex, to your arm subconsciously, you're not going to have any perception of it. And in one 2012 study, researchers even found that the effects of this are maximized when the participants strongly believe that they aren't the ones doing it. So therein lies the irony there, is that when people, if you've ever used a Ouija board with friends and you're like, oh my God, are you moving this? And someone's like, no, I'm totally not moving this. In all reality, they're most likely the ones moving it. And so oftentimes as well, what happens is if one person is asking the question and another person is moving it subconsciously, everyone else's psyche is going to follow that movement anyway, as opposed to resisting it. And so what ends up happening is you're asking questions and then your subconscious is answering them, as opposed to a spirit, and it's moving the planchette in accordance to that. And so the reason I bring up knowing history about the place is because if you visit a historically haunted hotel, for example, there's a hotel near where I'm going to live in Minnesota that is notoriously haunted. And I've read a lot about it, and I don't remember the names of the spirits they say are there, but my subconscious would. And so, like, if you know the history, more often than not, when you ask the question, what is your name? Your subconscious is going to come through with any old name. The first name that comes to mind, Jack, Tom, Mike, and it's going to spell that out. And you won't have any conscious perception of it because it's all unconscious. It's all in your subconscious mind, and all of these motor movements are in your subconscious mind. So, I guess then to summarize, when you use a Ouija board, are you connecting with the spirit world? No. You're connecting with your unconscious thoughts, which leads me into the last part of this, which is that a Ouija board is actually a pretty good communication tool, but it's not a communication tool for the spirit world. It's a communication tool to your subconscious mind. So much so that researchers have been studying the effects of using Ouija boards with Alzheimer's patients to understand what they're thinking. Because with Alzheimer's, a lot of times it's the conscious perception that's most affected, whereas the subconscious perception is not really affected. And because Ouija boards rely on your subconscious mind to answer questions and to move those muscles, it's a pretty good communication tool, at least in recent studies. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you today on this. Now, I know some of you, maybe, I don't actually know, but maybe some of you out there are going to be like, no, Atticus, there's no way that that's possible, that this is possible. If that is the case, I propose an experiment for you. Take a Ouija board, blind yourself, all right, wear like don't stab out your eyes, no. Wear like blindfolds or something, and get a bunch of people together for this. This would be fun. Get a bunch of people together for this, wear blindfolds, and then have somebody else ask the air quotes spirit questions and see what answers you get when everyone's blindfolded. Because the most recent studies have demonstrated that being able to visually see the planchette moving adds to the effects of the subconscious motor movements. But if you can't see where the letters are, you're not going to spell out anything coherent. And this has been an experiment that was already done that conclusively demonstrates, in my opinion, that it's not in tune with the spirit world. There's no mysticism about the Ouija board. It's just a fun toy to communicate with your own subconscious mind. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun for me to make. And, I really hope this clears up a lot of the misinformation out there about this, because I've seen Ouija boards used in terrible ways to extort people who have lost family members out of money. And if you know the science behind how it works, hopefully you can prevent that from happening to you. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again. Have a fantastic weekend. I will see you all on Monday. And until then, remember, stand up and question everything.